Hello everyone, welcome to the Quality Gems track of the TestCon Europe 2022. This is the second talk and we will going to talk about why testing with production data is a terrible idea. Our speaker is Mr. Martin Hart, who is head of consulting at TSG Consulting. He has more than 20 years experience in software testing. He has been one of the 10 finalists of the 2020 European Software Testing Awards. He might have been the first person to actually do a card transaction on January 1st, 2000. So he knows what production problems mean. And also under his supervision as a test manager at Visa, he has been authorizing 1.4 trillion euros per year. So he really knows what it means to not test with production data, what are the legal issues with it, and why it actually doesn't give any good test coverage. Martin, here you are.
Good morning or afternoon, wherever you are. Given that I'm seeing the meeting controls now, so you have my slides. Awesome, thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Just to clarify that is, my system authorized 1.4 trillion euros a year. If I had done that, I think I would be a very rich man. But anyway. Okay, today we want to talk about that testing with production data is a terrible idea, where the key issues really are that you're at risk of drawing regulatory attention to yourself, and that contrary to common belief, production data is actually offering very poor test coverage. Now, before we jump into the presentation, here are just a few information about TSG and myself. TSG is a small consultancy company that specializes in the financial services industry and especially its regulatory obligations. As Histrina mentioned, I have been a program and portfolio test manager for over 20 years. Currently, I'm at the head of consulting at TSG. In 2020, I was one of the 10 finalists for the European Testing Awards, and this year, my colleague Paul Young actually was also selected as a finalist. So here's the silver badge is my badge, and the gold badge is his one. So we have done rather well on the Deloitte sponsored awards this season. However, let's get started with the presentation about that testing with production data is a terrible idea. Now, I want to spend about the first 10 minutes discussing the some legal stuff and implications. That is rather boring, but I think it is important to understand what the implications are, especially penalties can be quite eye-watering. So I want to spend about 10 minutes discussing why production data offer only poor test coverage, because this is very contrary to beliefs that many people are holding. And last but not least, I want then to spend the rest of the presentation talk about practical solutions for data obfuscation and how to create synthetic test data, because I assume that people are more interested in the solution than they are in the problem. So without further ado, why is testing with production data a terrible idea? Now, testing with production data is something that most people consider a little bit naughty. Driving over the speed limit, jaywalking if you live in a country where it's actually illegal, making rude gestures behind someone's back. But in all of this example, nothing untoward will happen unless you are getting caught in the act, but then the consequences can be quite severe. So what are the challenges that we are facing? Production data usually contain personal identifiable information, the infamous PII. The presence of PII can lead to numerous legal challenges and non-compliance with industry standards, which we will discuss in a moment. And then again, adding insult to injury, production data actually do not provide good test coverage either, nor is using them good testing practices. Today we will discuss the challenges for test data and what the pragmatic solutions look like. Now, let's start with the legal implications of using production data for testing. Because production data contain, not in all cases, but in nearly all cases, and especially if you work in any financial setting whatsoever, so almost personal identifiable information. Now, even before we start talking about the actual regulation, there is quite a large body of laws that are applicable in the context. The big one is obviously GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, but also the Data Protection Act, Freedom of Information Act, Human Rights Act, or Public Relations Act. And my apology, because we have an international audience here, is I should have made clear that it is just the legislation that we are facing in the UK. In your own home countries, you will have similar legislation, but it will be variations onto a scheme. Now, in addition to all that legislation, then you also have industry standards to consider, of which are many. Now, to just pick two, since they are fairly universally applicable. One is PCI DSS, which everybody who's doing card payments has to comply with, which is the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, which outright forbids the use of production data. And HIPAA, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which is more important to people who are working in the health industry or selling health insurance and this kind of products. Now, one of the challenges is that all of that legislation is not particularly, it doesn't give good advice about what compliance would actually looks like. So in practice, you need legal advice very quickly when you are dealing with some of the more complex problems. In order to illustrate that, on the next slides, I'm just basically giving a bit of an outline that even the definitions of what personal data and PII are not as clear as one might think. So if you consider production data in the entirety, so production data is everything that is held on a production system, as a Venn diagram, then the production data are also including personal data. Now, personal data are actually defined in GDPR, and I'm not going to torture you with the description in here. But within personal data, you then also have the personal identifiable information. Now, and here is where it becomes a bit tricky, because PII is information that links individuals, living individuals, are linked to living individuals, such as things like the name, address, email addresses, and so on, so that are directly linkable to them. However, then you also have some other information like IP addresses, device profiles, and so on, that might or might not be PII, depending on the circumstances. Again, since we have an international audience in here, so in the UK, we would say if you need a solicitor. In your country, you might need a lawyer or a Rechtsanwalt if you are living in Germany or Austria or Switzerland. So the legal implications in detail are quite tricky to understand. However, we are technical people, so if we thinking about the big one and how GDPR is affecting the production environment, we put this one together as a quick reference that we are using for clients to basically outline to them on a high level what their responsibilities under the GDPR, what the legislation is, which I don't want to torture you about, because this is not a legal talk about the underlying laws. But for instance, if you just consider here under the GDPR umbrella that you have that the data subject has the right of correction and being forgotten. My screen is very small, but that are the ones here in the middle about. So if you are receiving data subject requests of correction or to be forgotten, so you have to action them in a production environment. Then you have got all the other legal implication. You have to have it safe. You have to have a legal basis of processing and so on. And while this is brilliant for the production environment, because GDPR is agnostic about where data is being stored. So if you are using production data in test development, UAT, and any other non-production environment, then exactly the same rules apply to you as well. So if you are managing to keep your production data in production and use either obfuscated or synthetic data, then all your problems regarding the GDPR legislation and so on. Sorry, my apology. Something has gone wrong, because in my original presentation there is a big bar through the whole thing, but it's improvised. So basically, so in the production data, so as a production, everything applies to you. Now, when you are using obfuscated or synthetic test data, so all these issues on here disappear like a puff of smoke. So you no longer have to worry about any of these legal implications in your test environment. So I'm sorry about that, not sure what happened, but just imagine that some two big red bars are striking this one out. Okay, so however, so I think the key message is that that not using production data, non-production environments make all these problems go away like a puff of smoke. Okay, moving on. One thing that is also not by many clients not that well understood is that when you are using production data in non-production environments, development test, UAT, and so on, that you then also put yourself at an exponential risk of data leakage, because non-production environments are typically not as well protected as production is. And that basically was also need to consider that PII can also leak out in various different ways. For instance, in non-production environment, so typically data are being extracted for development testing purposes. For instance, spreadsheet are a common culprit. Testers quite often extract data, put them in spreadsheets and so on. Wasn't here to use them then as testing oracles or to build testing oracles around it. To establish expected results. If you have report letters and statements, they might be printed for development and testing purposes. If you have production data in that environment, you will have the PII on these reports and so on. Now, emails, or especially if you have statements or something like that, they might be sent out to a print service provider for testing, and the print service provider might send them out by mistake to the customer and not back to you, which, by the way, has happened to me before, and the aftermath wasn't pretty. Emails or text can be sent out, and also not to forget is that PII might also then be stored in the testing tools. For instance, if you are building test cases and test scripts that the test is executing, they would then have PII in the test cases, since the testing is happening against production data. And if you're raising defects, that then customer name, account numbers, initial insurance number, and so on might also end up in the defects as well, which again might then be shared with vendors if you are integrating a system and so on. Now, it is also important to keep in mind that data leakage can be accidental. It can be driven by bad faith, or there can be even a criminal motivation behind the whole thing. However, so even if nobody is disgruntled, nobody is acting in bad faith, nobody has any criminal motivation, then just accidentally the data can be leaked. Now, this can then lead to tangible and intangible risks, in particular loss of reputation, coverage in traditional or social media, and so on, some which can reflect very badly against the company. Now, just sticking on this point a little bit longer is that there are numerous humorous or embarrassing episodes that can happen. For instance, was one rather embarrassing incident was that an email went out to a customer advising her that her accounts were frozen since she was deceased, which basically confused the lady an awful lot. So luckily she rang up and saw the funny side of it and didn't take it any further. At another occasion, one of the testers printed out a large pile of paper with confidential financial transactions in-house, so on one of the client's printers. Then the head of security walked past it, saw it, which then led to disciplinary action in some very awkward conversations with some very senior managers with this particular client. And also, more from the news items, many of you will have heard that this kind of data leakage has also happened on a rather large scale. For example, in 2010, somebody sold CDs with confidential Swiss bank information to the German tax office. Couple of years later, what is now known as the Panama Papers is where somebody leaked 2.6 terabytes of attorney-client data. WikiLeaks has quite a few very embarrassing things about the whole thing. So now we cannot say for sure if these data that have been leaked on such an industrial scale have been extracted from test systems or from a production system. But again, I think you get the gist of it is that the more systems you have that are storing PII or production data in PII on them, the exponentially higher is your risk that the data might leak. Okay, to summarize that is that GDPR does not distinguish where PI is being stored. So if it is stored on the production systems, that is great. But for each individual system that also then stores PI data, the more effort you have to protect, monitor, and police it. Now, also coming back to the legal implications is that one thing is that the legal basis of processing is something that that has caught out clients in the past. Because if in the term and condition it is not very clearly stated that the customer's personal data are being used for testing and software development, that means that the client has no legal basis for processing, which is a big no-no within the GDPR framework. Now, and again, just to reiterate the point, so if you do not use production data or PII outside your production system, you don't have to worry about any of that. Now, I think we all know that, but GDPR fines can be absolutely eye-watering. I'll just give a few examples in here. Now, in fact, there have been much higher fines actually being handed out for GDPR non-compliance. However, they were typically related to inappropriate cookie use, which is also not something that the average company has to concern themselves with. So therefore, I chose some fines that pretty much even the average company could face if there are data breaches, whistleblowing is taking place, and the regulator comes to investigate and to hand out fines. Also, just by the by, within GDPR, so which is at the bottom of the slide, is the framework allows for up to 20 million euros penalties out of the box if you are a multinational. So in case of an undertaking, GDPR fines can be up to 4% of the global turnover of the previous years. So the eye-wateringness of these fines, or some potential fines, cannot be underestimated. Now we are 10 minutes in, and we managed to cover all that lots of legal stuff. So in this case, let's move on to the next part of the presentation, also where we can talk about why production data offers poor requirements coverage. Okay, now we are past the legal stuff, but what's in here is one of these lovely ISTQB definition about the pesticide paradox. Now, the reason I'm putting this on the slide is just to illustrate that using of production data is not good practice according to ISTQB Watson either. Because in the pesticide paradox, ISTQB quite rightly states is that if you are reusing test cases over and over again, they stop being effective. Now, production data tend to cover the bread and butter scenarios, so you know what your organization is doing all the times very well, but also with significant duplication, but edge cases are really and ready-use functionality are not or very poorly covered. Now, what do I mean by that? I think I have got two pretty simple pictures here. And I would like to introduce you to the bell curve, and which is relating to production data, and to the pancake, which is how test data, how test specs and test data should look like. Now, if we're having a look at the left picture, the bell curve first, that is a very typical distribution you are seeing when you're looking at production data. Now, if you look at the also at the axis of the diagram is, so basically in the bottom you have a variety or coverage of the requirements that are provided by the data, and on the other axis you have volume. So in a typical production data scenario, what is happening is that about 20% of your requirements coverage is giving you 80% of the volume. So in these 20% in the middle that are all your bread and butter scenarios, they are covered very well, but again, they are covered also at the same time with a very high level of duplication. While on the edges, the coverage is dropping very quickly away, and that you are having rare and exotic test cases, requirements, you might not find also any of them in your production data. Now, if we look to the pancake on the right-hand side, that is actually how you want test coverage to look like for testing, is so that you're covering a wide variety of your requirements, ideally 100% with very little duplication. So that when you are testing, so you are testing effectively and not executing the same test case over and over and over again. Now, while this is lovely on higher level, let's give a few examples about what we mean by so let's elaborate on the bell curve and the pancake a bit more. So to give one example, I think most of you will be familiar with currency trading. So you have about, give or take, at the moment 183 currencies. Not all of them are being traded, but if you're doing for currency trading, is that you will have US dollar, euro, and GDP transactions, which are absolutely abundant because, you know, millions of them are being traded of them every single day. However, that there are also some currencies that are very exotic. So, for instance, you can have something like the Afghani or the West African franc, which are also being traded, but some which are traded on a much lower level. So if you, for instance, have to start testing with these exotic currencies, then you might not find anything depending where what kind of institution you are, and if you're even trading in these currencies or find them rarely. Now, the Afghani is also a bit of an odd one out here, but I think also it just reinforces the point is because, for instance, the Afghani is currently under sanctions. So if you have production data, you should not find any Afghani transactions in there whatsoever because, they are not supposed to be traded. There might be some exception, maybe humanitarian relief, but even that one is very unlikely. So if somebody asks you and said is, okay, I need you to test that particular currency, you couldn't because, you couldn't find it in your production sample. Since due to the sanctions, you shouldn't have any. So in fact, if you find some, that would be a bit on the odd side. Okay, but I think that should be illustrating the point. So that if you're having US dollars, euro, and GDP, you have an abundant pool to choose from. If you have something exotic, you might only find very few samples of them, or if any. Now, I've just given a couple of other examples. It very depends on the industry. But for instance, if you are offering vehicle insurance, you will sell a lot more car than camper van policies. If you are an airline, you will sell a lot more economies than first class seats and so on. So I think after these examples, since the whole thing is pretty self-evident, that the bell curve exists and how it affects your potential test data distribution. Also, sorry, just going back to the slide, is we're keeping this picture in mind is it also assumes that you have access to all your test data, all your data from production to choose from. However, very often, more often than not, is that for your potential selection, you only have a subset that has been extracted from production to choose from to extract test cases from there. Now, that can also quite often go horribly wrong. I think I have an example in here is, for instance, one of the clients I worked with is they extracted the test data in the US East Coast data center at 9 o'clock their time, which was 3 o'clock in the morning in London. And then if you look at the card transactions, you would be thinking is that all of London exclusively is making card payments in nightclubs, of licenses and so on, while you could hardly find a supermarket purchase in there. And so therefore, that data cut from production wasn't representative at all, which was a problem which people had to work around the whole thing is. But again, so if you think about the bell curve, if you have a subset selected from them, it makes the situation only worse than it already is. Now, moving away from production data and talking about the pancake. Now, the pancake is very much what's in the holy grail of testing, because in order to test efficiently, what you want is a high coverage of your requirements, ideally 100%. And very little duplication, so it is so you can test effective. Also, keeping in mind is if you have complex testing and not just user interface testing. So if you are achieving this kind of coverage with your complex test cases, then then test automating them and making them automated regression test packs also becomes a lot faster, cheaper, and a lot more effective. However, achieving a pancake requires skill and especially analytical skill and testing technique skill. Now, I'm going to talk about that one in the last part of the presentation quite extensively, so I leave it for now. So, in this case, I was here to summarize the use of production data. Summarizing the use of production data is that production data usually provides poor test coverage about also the bread and butter scenarios. That the bread and butter scenarios are highly duplicated, and that PII, if PII is present in the production data, it can lead to regulatory and legal consequences. We talked about the eye-watering GDPR fines, and that production data are used as comfort blankets while they are considered cheap solutions, but both assumptions are usually not correct. So, then what are the solution options? Okay, there are basically two solution options. So one is that the production data can be obfuscated. The other one is to use synthetic data to create data from scratch. So if you think about data obfuscation can be achieved with extensive tool support, which there are quite a few very high functional products out there, which can fast track that one quite greatly. Which result in that the PII problem of having regulated data in the test pack is going away. However, the bell curve will still be maintained, so that while the data are no longer contain PII, they are also still attracting the bell curve. While with synthetic test data, will lead to the pancake. However, there is a lot of analytical labor involved in creating these test packs, and it is a skilled activity which is front-loaded. So even if you are having TDM tool support, which hopefully we have a chance to talk about in a moment, it usually takes longer to achieve that, and it also usually requires more business support to understand the data and to get on with it. Now, whatever path you head down is that the data that are coming out of obfuscation or that are synthetically created still have the same referential integrity quality that the production data had. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a like-for-like replacement. In practice, that can become very tricky because, for instance, even as example, if you're exchanging some postcodes in London, you have, for instance, Westminster as a prosperous area and Islington as a deprived one. So you couldn't exchange these postcodes as part of an obfuscation exercise. So you have to find a like for like. So for instance, for Westminster, you would have to find a Chelsea postcode, and for Islington, was a Hackney postcode. So the devil is in the detail, but that can become quite complex very quickly, and also require some skill and expertise. Now, talking about data obfuscation. I just run through this quickly because from the data obfuscation, there are some main ways on how to achieve it. Now, typically, data obfuscation is sitting in the production zone with your production systems, so that from your production data, you extract them, you obfuscate them. So once they have become obfuscated, you can safely push them into a non-production environment and load them there. Now, variation on the scheme, that is very often that you have a standalone environment that is connected to your production zone and also pushing it out. But then again, it does also pretty much the same thing. A key consideration for having an obfuscation process is that every time something is being developed and then pushed into production that affects your PII, the data obfuscation process needs to be updated as well. So also that you have a constant feedback loop from your new development. So your new development becomes the production status, and then because the production status has changed, the data obfuscation has to change as well. Now, then as the last part, and I think we are running a bit late on time, so again, I will make this one fairly quickly. Is now, when we're talking about synthetic data and how to compile an efficient test pack out of it, it is so that one happens in the non-production zone because you're not using production data at all. And therefore, it is a manual activity that requires some analytical skills, but can be supported by TDM tools. And there is an example in the last few slides. Now, the typical techniques that the analysts will have to use is equivalence partitioning, boundary value analysis, classification tree analysis, and less commonly state transition testing techniques. Given that we are running out of time now, so I'll just go through this one very quickly. In my slides, I just have a very basic sample requirements, which is basically based on hypothetical food delivery service that basically charge a customer by various ways, for the distance, how the delivery is taking place, and when the delivery is taking place. An analyst would then basically go through the whole thing and identify also all the challenges with ambiguity of the requirements, which I have outlined over here, where I not just stick to it. Now, then breaks the whole thing down in equivalence partitioning, saying is, okay, so we have the input partitions of distance, where the delivery is taking place, on what day, and it takes place in the bank holiday, and what the various charges are. So based on this analytical work, then the client, an analyst could then come up with a classification tree like that, and basically saying is, okay, there are 70 scenarios, but then looking at it, there is a lot of duplications, or the bank holiday and so on. So a more skilled analyst could then condense the whole thing into 7 requirements, which then would cover all the eventuality, and in particular makes the whole thing here auditable, because you can precisely prove to an auditor that you have 7 test conditions here, not 6, not 8, and this approach would cover all the permutations of that particular requirement. Now, obviously, I did this one with a very, very basic tool, but one of our partners is Curiosity, who are offering a product which is the test modeler, which is a product I highly recommend. Curiosity kindly scripted so my classification tree from here, which is a more textbook design, into the actual test modeler, and as you can see, so they are using a very similar approach to the classification tree analysis, but then offers a tool support, which then also allows you to create test data from them, even if they're in a bit more complex format, like JSON or ISO 8583. And as they also kind of provided is some more generic slides. For instance, here they spelled something out that would be if it was a mobile app, the versioning and so on. So again, for this kind of textbook testing technique application, You can also get tool support. Something like the test modeler, also, which in my opinion, having worked with, is a very good tool. But again, I'm sure there are also others out there. Now we are covered. Sorry, there's a summary, and I think then we have covered it. Okay, so just to summarize, what we have just discussed is for legal compliance and ethical requirements. So testing with production data is a terrible idea, which I hope you agree with me now is. If you're using data obfuscation, you overcome the legal and compliance challenges, but you are then still stuck with the bell curve of having requirements coverage only for a bread and butter scenario with high duplication. If you're heading down the testing, the synthetic test data route, then you can get complete test requirements coverage if your analysts have the required skill for that one. But it is a front-loaded activity, that also requires skill. And last but not least, data integrity is an absolute essential thing. That in practice is fairly complex to achieve, and it requires skill and expertise. Okay, now I'm getting some questions through here. So sorry, I just need a drink, and then I'm going through them and start answering them. Okay. Sorry. So the first question from Nicola is, what about masking and changing production data for testing purposes instead of creating new testing data? Thank you, Nicola. That is basically what I mean by data obfuscation, which is, as you said, masking and changing production data. Again, as we have explained, the downside of that one is that you are then be stuck with the bell curve, and you have a lot of your standard scenarios and very little on the edges, if any. Second question from Gabriela: how do you deal with finding bugs that can be found only by using production data? This happens sometimes, and even using small data sets of analyzed data can easily reveal hidden bugs and would otherwise be costly. I'm sorry. I think this is, and also I think there are a number of wrong assumptions in there. So basically, finding bugs is one thing. Finding most of the bugs in a structured way is a completely different thing. For that, you need comprehensive requirements coverage, as we have outlined. So if you have small subsets of data, so you are effectively, hoping for the best is, I think, if you're not a marksman, that is when you are shooting lots of bullets, and you spray and pray, rather than focusing in on on actually to finding the defects. Okay, and the third question, what about the golden rule of QA that you're not able to cover 100% potential test cases? From my experience, production data is partly filling this gap. Being able to use the data of running tests and doing analysis is invaluable. Of course, it's all anonymized. Okay, fair point, Jan, because again, so what's in the, I think it's the first testing principle on ISTQB is that comprehensive testing is not possible. Again, we could be talking about risk-based testing in this respect. Unfortunately, we're out of time, and this is another very substantial topic as well. So so you won't. So typically, you won't be able to achieve 100% test coverage. But then again, I think risk-based testing is the way to go. And again, I think, as we have discussed, is production data is giving you a very, it can partially, but also very narrowly fill the gap, especially at the edges. And I think quickly, fourth question from Agnieszka: what about the informal value and production data when we are sure whether our test case is similar enough to the real data? I'm talking about production data and test environment, of creating test data based on production data to make sure that our tests will be valid not only for the test environment. Okay, I mean, there are actually systems where you can be some pretty sure that certain business applications that your production data are a clear representation also of your actual requirements. And so also then just obfuscating samples about the whole thing can be an option, but I think this applies only for a relatively small subset of applications, especially in the financial service industry when you are talking about banking, insurances, regulated industries, or the airline industry, another very good one. I think this would not be practical, but I'm sure there are pockets and exceptions for the whole thing. Okay, I think then I answered or tried to answer all the questions, and I think we're pretty much on time.
Right on time. Thank you so much, Martin. We need to be careful with production data, better not use it at all. Thank you very much for your insightful approaches to how to come with actual coverage. I think this is, we forget from time to time. We kind of tend to, it's easy to use production. We don't have time to generate all the test cases. Well, yes, we have, and we should, and there's structured way to achieve coverage. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for your questions. See you in the next track in 5 minutes.
Thank you. Bye-bye.